wait, English. Quite right. If you could be so kind, Archie, could you lead us in prayer?
В ім'я Отця і Сина і Святого Духа, амінь. В ім'я Отця і Сина і Святого Духа, амінь. В ім'я Отця і Сина і Святого Духа, амінь. Царю небесний, утішителю, душі вічної, що всюди єси і все наповняєш, скарбниці плаття, життя подяк, прийди вселися в нас, і очисти нас від усякої скверні, і спаси благий душі наші. Слава Отцю і Сину і Святому Духові, і нині повсякчас, і на віки віків. Амінь. Господи помилуй, Господи помилуй, Господи помилуй, Владику благослови.
Благословення Господне до вас, його, що давнім повсякчас, на віки віків.
Амінь. В ім'я Отця і Сина і Святого Духа, амінь. В ім'я Отця і Сина і Святого Духа, амінь. В ім'я Отця і Сина і Святого Духа, амінь. Слава Ісусу Христу.
Слава навіки. Дякую дуже. Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin, we received a greeting from the Archbishop that I would now like to read to you. Dear Dr. Ivankovich, dear participants, please accept my warm greeting on the occasion of the symposium, The Voice of the Persecuted, which draws our attention to an excruciating yet spiritually victorious and fruitful chapter in the history of our church. To the suffering and courageous witness of Patriarch Yosef Slipi and the other bishops who did not renounce their faith, even in the face of imprisonment and repression, even death. Confronted with the overwhelming force of totalitarianism, the Church, its leaders and faithful, remained unbroken. This symposium is a vital voice of remembrance, resonating especially today as the world longs for living examples of steadfastness, spiritual dignity, and fidelity to God's truth. Thank you for this important initiative which brings minds and hearts together around our shared heritage. Although I wish to be with you, due to commitments in Washington, I am unfortunately unable to attend in person. Yet I remain united with you in spirit, in prayer, in remembrance, and in our shared calling to carry forward the light of faith kindled in the hearts of our confessors. Today, our church and our country face new challenges and new threats. For those who see with eyes of faith, the Via Crucis and resurrection of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church clearly and convincingly reveal that God is the Lord of history. We have witnessed His miraculous works in the past, and so we must not fear or doubt the future. God is with us. In the following week, we will remember and relive His passions and resurrections to redeem us from sin and grant us life everlasting. In the spirit of the Paschal mystery, I wish you inspiration, meaningful reflection, and a joyful gathering in service of the truth. Christos Voskres. With respect and prayer, Bishop Boris. Дякую. Ladies and gentlemen, Reverend Fathers, Venerable Sisters, Your Excellency, thank you all for joining this morning for today's program, The Voice of the Persecuted, a commemoration of the 80th anniversary of the arrest of Patriarch Yosef Slipi and the bishops of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. Since its very inception on that fateful day in 1596, when the hierarchs of the lands of Ukraine joined in union with the Holy See in Rome, it has faced persecution reminiscent of the most blessed martyrs. I'm reminded of a similar conference we had back in the 90s. It was an ecumenical time and a panel with members of the Russian Orthodox Church taking place. When the topic of the Black Synod of 46 was raised, they stated most emphatically there was a tragedy for which those godless Soviets were entirely to blame. This argument was revealed to be less than compelling, as the 1839 Synod of Polotsk, 107 years prior to the events of today's conference talks about, took place. That Synod dissolved the Greek Catholic Church in the Russian Empire and transferred all its holdings to the Orthodox State Church. Sounds familiar, does it not? And I think that reveals an important distinction that deserves consideration. The Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, as it's called today, has since its very inception and through its varied iterations, has always been a national church. It is connected with the people of Ukraine at its very roots. What it's never been, however, and nor should it ever aspire to be, I would say, is a state church, like the one that is found north of Ukraine's lands. That church has ever been a department, just like many other government offices, housed in halls of secular power and intrinsically linked to the bureaucracy of the state and the temptations of Caesar papism, be it Muscovite, Tsarist, Bolshevik, or Putinist. Our first speaker today is Andrew Sudakovsky. Professor Sudakovsky was born in Hartford, Connecticut in 1950. He grew up in San Francisco and was educated at the University of California, where he earned his bachelor's and his Juris Doctoris. Harvard University for his master's, and the School of Slavonic and East European Studies of the University of London for his doctorate. He was the first researcher on religion in Ukraine at Keystone College, England in 1984 and 87. In 89 and 90, he served as an archivist on the chancery staff of Major Archbishop Miroslav Ivan Cardinal Lupachevsky in Rome. Dr. Sudakovsky was managing editor of the journal Harvard Ukrainian Studies from 1993 to 97. He taught history at St. Basil College Seminary in Stamford, Connecticut, Assumption College in Worcester, Maine, and University of Massachusetts in Boston and Lowell, and the Ukrainian Catholic University in Ukraine and online. From 2000 to 2014, he served as Historical Research and Information Specialist at the U.S. Department of Justice, Environment and National Resources Division in Washington, D.C. From 2007 to 2021, Dr. Sudakovsky published the monthly column Cross Currents in the Ukrainian Weekly. He has edited and contributed to works on Ukraine and general church history, and published numerous reviews, articles, and translations of historical and poetic texts. He lives in Sonoma, California, and we are so glad to have him join us here today across the Great Divide electronically to talk about the abuse of law and the legal methods of repression against clergy and laity in the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church in the USSR between 1945 and 1990. Please welcome Dr. Andrew Sudakovsky.
Thank you. Your Excellency, Most Reverend Fathers, Reverend Sisters, brothers, ladies and gentlemen. Today I shall discuss how the Soviet state used law to repress the clergy and laity of the Greek Catholic Church in Ukraine, in Soviet Ukraine, between the church's suppression in 1945-6 and its legalization in 1989-91. The suppression of the Greek Catholic Church and the persecution of its believers over the next 40 years was a violation of the most fundamental human right, freedom of conscience and religion. That right protects not only, or even primarily, the holding of religious beliefs, something that it is impossible to prevent, but the exercise of those beliefs. Because of the Soviet Union's patently unlawful policy towards the Church, most commentators paid little or no attention to the laws invoked in carrying it out. The Soviet use of law to implement its repressive policy towards the Church occurred on more than one level. Most critical attention has been focused on procedure, arbitrary arrest and detention, trumped-up charges, brutal interrogations and torture during investigation, inadequate access to and representation by defense counsel, closed trials, use of coerced or perjured testimony, and excessively harsh sentences. Conditions in Soviet prisons and forced labor camps were also criticized as not conforming to minimum standards of humanity. Some of the statutes under which believers were prosecuted likewise did not pass muster under general principles of law. For example, the prohibition of anti-Soviet propaganda and slandering the Soviet state. These are at odds with freedom of speech. Generally recognized criminal offenses like treason or hooliganism, too, were often interpreted very broadly. Finally, the instrumentalization or weaponization of law itself as a tool of state and party policy vitiated legality, particularly in cases involving sensitive matters like religion. But as Harold J. Berman, who had studied Soviet law during the Stalin period, pointed out, To ignore the law of even a lawless state is a mistake. Law and arbitrary terror sometimes exist side by side. The study of Soviet law reveals a great deal about the nature of that regime, including its policies on religion. Here I will list the chief statutes under which Ukrainian Greek Catholic clergy and laity were tried, along with the corresponding punishments, briefly discussing notable cases brought under them. Why did the Soviet regime use law to suppress the UGCC? Most likely, its purpose was not only to justify its actions before its own citizens or foreign observers with a cloak of legality, for the law also served as a mechanism for the efficient implementation of government policy. In this case, the policy of annihilating the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. And in its first decades, the USSR had worked out a system of laws pertaining to religion that later could be applied to the bishops, priests, and laity of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. That system was based on a legal philosophy that was itself based on Marxism-Leninism. In civil law, unlike Anglo-American common law, there exists the concept of abuse of rights. In discussing the role of law in the repression of the UGC, of Ukrainian Greek Catholics in the USSR, I use the term abuse of law. In Western legal systems, all parties, including the state itself, are subject to the law. Power serves the law, not the other way around. The law itself is derived from universal principles of justice and reason, as well as society's experience as embodied in the common law. Soviet Marxist legal theory, on the other hand, saw the law as a political tool of socio-economic classes. And this in turn justified the Bolshevik Party acting in the name of the proletariat in using the law as a political weapon against the bourgeois class in order to create a socialist society. Indeed, under Joseph Stalin, Communist Party directives were regarded as superior to laws. Consequently, although Soviet law used familiar Western legal terms, the statutes it enacted and the procedures by which they were enforced served specific social or political goals. This approach was particularly evident in the repression of religious groups, including the clergy and laity of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church between 1945 and 1990. Under the 1929 law on religious associations, as amended to 1975, in order to acquire legal personality and thus to hold gatherings, lease or own property, hire a clergyman, a religious group had to register with the government. Clergymen, too, were subject to registration and limitations on their activity. By refusing to register the parishes and clergy of a given religious denomination, the state could effectively prevent it from functioning, even without passing a law to formally ban it. That was the case with the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. Upon the termination of Party First Secretary Nikita Khrushchev's anti-religious campaign with his ouster in October 1964, there was a tendency to avoid charging religious believers with political crimes, such as anti-Soviet agitation. Instead, special articles were enacted on violation of the legislation on separation of church and state, and infringement of citizens' persons and rights under the guise of religious preaching or rituals. The Brezhnev Constitution, so-called, of 1977, which was heavily based on Khrushchev's reforms, provided under Article 52 for freedom of conscience. That is, to profess or not profess religious belief, the right to worship and to conduct atheist propaganda, the prohibition of incitement of hostility or hatred on religious grounds, and the separation of church from state and school from church. Nevertheless, in the view of Albert Boiter, there was no substantial change in Soviet religious law and policy between 1960 and 1987. Although periods of normalcy and repression affected both law and religion roughly in tandem, throughout all periods they remained subordinate to political objectives. With Party General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev's liberalization from 1985, however, most prisoners of conscience were eventually released. 2 decrees issued in February 1987 provided the prisoners of conscience convicted of anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda, or slandering the Soviet state and social system, could be pardoned if they undertook not to repeat the offense. A number of religious prisoners were thus released. On December 1st, 1989, a government decision to register Greek Catholic groups of believers was made public in connection with Gorbachev's visit to the Holy See. A new Soviet law on freedom of conscience and religious organizations was passed in 1990, and a Ukrainian counterpart was enacted on April 23, 1991. This led to the full legalization of the UGCC by a decision of the Ukrainian SSR Council of Ministers of May 28, 1991, confirming its charter. Now, it is against this legal background that we must examine Soviet policy towards the UGCC after the Soviet reoccupation of Western Ukraine in 1945. The basic policy to liquidate the church was formulated in February and March of 1945 and set out in a directive of mid-March 1945 by Georgy Karpov, chairman of the Council on Russian Orthodox Affairs, with Stalin's approval. It was apparently motivated by several factors. There was, of course, the Soviet government's general opposition to religion and church. To be sure, it had made a rapprochement with the Russian Orthodox Church, ROC, which had proven itself a willing collaborator with the regime. From this proceeded a second motivation. Since the ROC had claims upon the Uniate, formerly Orthodox Greek Catholics, whom it sought to reunite with it, the government was reluctant to recognize the latter. Indeed, as a socially integrating factor, the ROC served the traditional Russian emphasis on a spiritually monolithic society. Such a society, which served the party's interest in political domination, could not tolerate a church that represented a break with orthodoxy. Furthermore, the government's attempt between December 1944 and March 1945 to persuade the UGCC leadership to call on the Ukrainian underground nationalist insurgents to lay down their arms had failed. This was not surprising, as the UGCC had become a national church, almost an ersatz government, for the stateless Western Ukrainians, particularly under the leadership of Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky. It thus stood in the way of political integration with the USSR. Finally, the Soviet regime perceived the church's ties to a hostile Vatican as subversive of Soviet power. Thus, it was decided that the UGCC should be dissolved and its parishes, clergy, and laity transferred to the ROC. This was achieved through the arrests of several UGCC bishops and higher clergy on April 11, 1945, with subsequent arrests of Greek Catholic bishops and clergy in Poland and later in the Transcarpathian region. And also the creation of an initiative group that appealed to the Ukrainian SSR Council of Ministers for reunification with Orthodoxy. After a positive response from the Council on Russian Orthodox Affairs on June 18, 1945, a church council, so-called, was orchestrated that met in Lviv on March 8 to 10, 1946. At the same time, the laws on religious associations were applied to the clergy. In 1945 and 46, over 800 Greek Catholic priests were arrested and tried. Of the 590 who refused to join the Orthodox Church, 344 were arrested and sentenced. Simultaneously, a campaign to liquidate the Greek Catholic Church in Transcarpathia was begun and extended using somewhat different methods into 1949. During 1945 and 6, while the initiative group for so-called reunion with the Russian Orthodox Church was pressuring UGCC priests to join the ROC, priests were also interviewed and threatened by the NKGB, and some were tortured. Recalcitrant priests were tried before tribunals for collaboration with the Germans or with the bourgeois nationalists, and sentenced to 10-year terms of imprisonment with confiscation of property, and their families were exiled to Siberia, the Soviet Far East, or Kazakhstan. During the 1940s and over subsequent decades, the Soviet government used various statutes against UGCC bishops, clergy, religious, and laity who refused to convert to Russian Orthodoxy. Those relating specifically to religion were the following. Article 138 of the Criminal Code of the Ukrainian SSR, violation of the laws on separation of church and state and of school and church. Punishment varied from 1 to 5 years of corrective labor, that is in the camps, which was later reduced to 1 year or a fine of 50 rubles. Recidivists and those organizing activity aimed at committing the above actions could be punished by deprivation of liberty for up to 3 years. Article 138 was used in the following cases, among others. After his second arrest, in 1969 in Lviv, the future Bishop Vasil Velichkovsky, was held in a prison for 8 months. On September 23, 1969, he was tried in Lviv and accused, among other things, of writing a book on a miraculous icon, listening to religious programs on Vatican radio, organizing and supervising courses in theology in Ternopil, catechizing a minor, reproducing and disseminating religious pictures and antimensions, and posing as a bishop. He was sentenced under Article 138.2, as well as Article 187.1, noted below, to 3 years confinement in a strict regime labor camp. Father Mihailo Vinitsky was sentenced on July 3, 1975, in a People's District Court in Lviv, under Article 138, Paragraph 2, to 3 years deprivation of liberty. As noted below, he was also sentenced under Article 209. Father Roman Yesip was arrested on March 18, 1981, and charged under Article 138, Paragraph 2, as well as Article 209. His allegedly illegal activity included conducting religious services and catechism in private homes and in registered Orthodox churches without permission. He pleaded partially guilty as he admitted to being a priest of an unregistered church. Father Yesip was tried on October 20th to 28th, 1981, and sentenced to 5 years ordinary regime camp and 3 years exile. All the religious items confiscated from him were turned over to the Lviv Museum of Religion and Atheism. Father Vasil Kavatsy was arrested on March 18th, 1981, the same day as Father Roman Yesip. Together with Father Yesip, he was charged under both Article 138, Paragraph 2 and Article 209, and tried in October 1981. Like his colleague, he pleaded partially guilty as a priest of an unregistered church. He had conducted services and catechism in private homes and in registered Orthodox churches without permission. The religious items confiscated from him, like those taken from Father Jessup, were transferred to the Lviv Museum of Religion and Atheism. He was sentenced to 5 years ordinary regime camp and 3 years exile. Next, Article 209, which I just mentioned, infringement of the person and rights of citizens under the guise of performing religious rituals. This statute was initially aimed at Pentecostals. The penalties varied depending on the nature of the activity, but the penalty was higher under the Ukrainian code than under the Russian one. Article 209 was invoked in these cases, among others. The second arrest of Father Ignatiy Soltis, the leader of the penitence movement, or Pokutniki, took place on July 2nd, 1962 in Stry. At an open session of the Lviv Regional Court held in Grody, Father Soltis was sentenced on October 2nd, 1962 to 5 years imprisonment under Article 209, paragraph 1, offense against a person under the guise of performing religious rituals. And this was to be served in a corrective labor colony under strict regime. On November 20th, 1962, his appeal to the Supreme Court of the Ukrainian SSR was rejected. Father Mikhailo Vinnytsky was sentenced on July 3rd, 1975, in Lviv District Court, under Article 209, paragraph 1, to 5 years deprivation of liberty and 3 years exile with confiscation of property. His two sentences, under Article 138 and 209, were combined as 5 years deprivation of liberty plus 3 years exile with confiscation of all personal property and deprivation of liberty to be spent in a corrective labor colony under general regime. He was released in 1983. Father Vinnytsky was arrested for the fourth time in June 1985, near Lviv. Although the charges were under the law against parasitism, he was reportedly sentenced in 1986 to 5 years in labor camps under strict regime and 5 years exile under different charges under Article 209. Father Ignatiy Soltis was arrested on January 21st, 1981. This was his fifth arrest. Charged under Article 209, he was tried on July 12th and sentenced to 5 years strict regime camp and 5 years exile. Father Roman Yevsik was arrested on March in 1981 and charged under Article 209, paragraph 1. As noted above, he was sentenced to 5 years ordinary regime and 3 years in exile. Father Vasil Kavasiev, arrested again the same day as Father Roman Yevsik, as I mentioned, was likewise charged under Article 209, paragraph 1. The following statutes, not specifically pertaining to religion, were frequently used to persecute religious believers, including those of the UGCC. Article 54 of the Criminal Code was repealed in 1956 and replaced from 1961 by Article 56. Various sections of Article 54 were used in the 1940s and 1950s against Ukrainian Greek Catholics who refused to join the Russian Orthodox Church. Article 54-1 was titled Any Activity That Is Aimed at Overthrowing, Subverting, or Weakening the Rule of the Workers' and Peasants' Soviets or Workers' and Peasants' Governments of the USSR and Union and Autonomous Republics, or any activity aimed at the subversion or weakening of the external security of the USSR, or of the basic economic, political, and national conquests of the proletarian revolution, is considered counter-revolutionary. So this was a very broad statute, and a political one, obviously. Article 54.1a was treason against the fatherland. This included espionage, betrayal of military or state secrets, defection to the enemy, and escaping abroad. The maximum sentence was execution, with confiscation of property. In extenuating circumstances, it was 10 years deprivation of freedom with confiscation of property. The sentence could be followed by 5 years exile, that is, internal exile. Article 54-10, anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda. This was based on Article 58 of the 1927 Russian Criminal Code, and it was also called counter-revolutionary agitation. Article 58.10 of the Russian Criminal Code punished propaganda or agitation calling for overthrow or undermining of Soviet rule. Punishments varied from 6 months imprisonment up to the death penalty in times of war or unrest. This was replaced in the 1960 Russian Code by Article 70, and that was analogous to Article 62 of the 1961 Ukrainian SSR Criminal Code. So they were working in tandem, of course. Article 54-11, organizational activity, aimed at the preparation or commission of counter-revolutionary crimes, or participation in any organization created to prepare or commit counter-revolutionary crimes. This could be punished with deprivation of liberty for 10 to 25 years, often with confiscation of property, and often followed by forfeiture of civil rights for another 5 to 10 years. So a particularly harsh statute. Article 54 was used, in the various variants of Article 54, was used against the Ukrainian Catholic bishops arrested in 1945 and 46. Metropolitan Yosef Slipy was arrested by the NKGB on April 11th in Lviv, 1945. By April 21st, the NKGB had arrested 33 people in the Lviv region. Metropolitan Yosef, Bishops Nikita Budka and Nikolai Chernetsky, 20 priests, 2 deacons, 3 seminarians, and 5 laymen. Also on April 11th, Bishops Grigory Khumishin and Ivan Yatashevsky were arrested in Stanislavl, along with seminary rector Father Avksentij Boychuk. Metropolitan Yosef's closed trial by an MVD military tribunal began on May 29, 1946, in Kyiv, along with Bishop Budka, Bishop Chernetsky, and Monsignor Petro Verhul, and lasted until June 3rd. Metropolitan Yosef was charged with treason, as being a Vatican spy and an enemy of the Soviet people, living at their expense and engaging in counter-revolution. The hierarchs were charged with treason to the fatherland under Article 54.1a and 54.11. According to the summary of the indictment published in the newspaper Vilna Ukraina on March 1st, 1946, the 5 bishops had collaborated with the Gestapo and with German intelligence during the Nazi occupation of 1941-4, had called for anti-Soviet resistance, had aided the German war effort, had participated in the formation of the Galician SS division, and so on. Monsignor Verhun was charged under Articles 54.2 and 54.11. All were convicted. Slipy with a sentence of 8 years in forced labor camps with confiscation of property. Although he was a German citizen, Monsignor Verhun was also convicted and sentenced to 8 years. Bishops Chernetsky and Budka received 5 years each. All were deprived of his civil rights for a further 3 years. In the Transcarpathian region, out of 315 priests who had remained in the Mukachu eparchy, 140 accepted orthodoxy under duress. More than half of them eventually repented and returned to the Greek Catholic Church. Most of the 175 who resisted received sentences of 25 years imprisonment under Articles 54.4 and 54.10. paragraph 2. The Studite hieromonk, Father Herman or Hrihori Budzinski, had served as translator in the Greek Catholic delegation that traveled to Moscow in December 1944 to meet with Soviet government and Russian Orthodox representatives. He was arrested on May 28, 1945, after refusing to join the initiative group for the unification of the UGCC with the ROC. Father Budzinski was held at the Lonsky Street prison in Lviv, where he was interrogated and tortured. On March 13, 1946, he was sentenced under Article 5410 to 10 years hard labor. After serving his sentence at the Vorkuta labor camps, he returned to Lviv in 1956. He was arrested again on May 15, 1957, convicted, and sentenced to another term in the labor camps, serving it in the Mordovian ASSR. The Redemptorist, Father Velichkovsky's first arrest was on August 7, 1945, in Ternopil. After refusing to sign a transfer to Orthodoxy, he was imprisoned and tortured in Chortkyu, then transferred to the Lukyanivska prison in Kyiv for further investigation and interrogation. He eventually confessed to having published a small calendar in Stanislavia, which contained the words, "Save us from the Red Horde." On January 8, 1946, he was charged with anti-Soviet propaganda in the form of sermons, forming anti-Soviet organizations, supporting the anti-Soviet actions of Ukrainian nationalists by writing a greeting in a nationalist newspaper, organizing a celebration in honor of the German occupiers, and publishing anti-Soviet nationalist literature. He admitted to the charges. He was tried in a regional court on June 26, 1946, found guilty, and sentenced under Article 5410 to death by firing squad, with confiscation of property. After he had spent about 3 months on death row, his sentence was commuted to 10 years at hard labor. He was held in labor camps in Kyiv Oblast and Vorkuta. Bishop Velichkovsky returned to Lviv in 1955. The Polish government arrested Bishop Józef Kocelowski of Peremyśl on September 21, 1945, released him on January 24, 46, and arrested him again on June 25th, along with Bishop Hrihori Lakota and other clergy. The Polish authorities turned the bishops over to the Soviets for trial and sentencing in Kyiv. It is likely that he was sentenced under Article 54, like the others. Bishop Kocelowski died on November 17, 1947, at Chapayivka near Kyiv. Archimandrite Clemente Sheptytsky was arrested June 5, 1947, and tried by the USSR Ministry of State Security, the NGB, on February 28, 1948. He was convicted under Articles 54-1A and 54-11 and sentenced to 8 years in corrective labor camps. He died in prison in Vladimir, Russia, on May 1, 1951. Many reports do not specify the statutes under which religious believers were arrested, tried, and sentenced, but only name the alleged crime. In some cases, the statute can be inferred from the charges. One such case is that of Father Alexander Hira of Uzhhorod, who fulfilled the functions of bishop in Transcarpathia after the assassination of Bishop Theodor Romja in 1947. The NGB unsuccessfully urged him to convert to Orthodoxy. He was arrested on February 10, 1949, and tried with others for sabotage. Nearly all the defendants were convicted and sentenced to 25 years, then transferred to a Kyiv prison for interrogation. The charges were probably brought under Article 54-4 or 54-10. The NGB sought to add the charge of treason, alleging secret Vatican ties. After the Lviv Pseudo-Council of March 1946, Father Bogdan Sanata refused to join the Russian Orthodox Church. He was arrested March 12, 1950, accused of aiding criminal bands, and exiled to a special settlement in the Tomsk region of Russia, where he was confined until 1954. The leader of the penitents, or Pokutniki cult, Father Ignatiy Soltis, was arrested on December 4, 1958 in Broshnyu in the Kalush district, and charged by the KGB with anti-Soviet activity under Article 54-10, subparagraph 2, and with planning to create a Union church in his region. Due to lack of evidence, however, this charge was dropped, and he was instead accused of parasitism under a decree of the Presidium of the USSR Supreme Soviet of July 1951 on the struggle against anti-Soviet and parasitical elements. On March 19, 1959, a People's Court of the Stanislav region convicted and sentenced him to 5 years exile at labor with a prohibition to live in Ukraine for 5 years afterwards. In the Transcarpathian region, Domak M. Margitic was tried in regional court on December 16, 17, 1958, and convicted under Article 54-10-2 for writing letters to Joseph Sliby containing false information about the Greek Catholic Church in Transcarpathia. He was sentenced to 7 years deprivation of liberty in corrective labor camps, with deprivation of rights for another 2 years. The other important article of this time period, 40s and 50s, was Article 62, which actually in 1961 it replaced Article 54-10. And this was also on anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda. It included propaganda or agitation with the purpose of undermining or weakening Soviet power, or with the purpose of committing an incitement to commit particularly grave crimes against the Soviet state, also spreading with the same purposes of slanderous fabrications directed against the Soviet political and social system, and finally, production, dissemination, or storage for the same purposes of literature with anti-Soviet content. The penalty varied from 6 months to 7 years imprisonment, with possible subsequent internal exile from 2 to 5 years. The penitent leader, Father Ignatiy Soltis, was convicted on October 2, 1962, under this article, 62-1, to 7 years in prison. As noted above, he was also sentenced under Article 209. On November 20, 1962, his appeal to the Supreme Court of the Ukrainian SSR was rejected. However, and this was already in 1964, this was already after the fall of Khrushchev and the end of his anti-religious campaign, the USSR Procuracy protested the verdict, and the Ukrainian Supreme Soviet removed Article 62 from the verdict on September 16, 1965. Also arrested and charged under Article 62 were well-known dissidents Miroslav Marinovich and Mykola Matusevich in 1977. The case officer stated that as members of the Helsinki monitoring group, they should be tried under Article 64, creation of an anti-Soviet organization, which carried a heavier penalty. The writer Mykola Rudenko and Miroslav Marinovich were also charged with crimes committed in Russia under Article 70 of its criminal code, corresponding to the Ukrainian Article 62 on anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda. Article 70 of the Russian Code was the basis for the arrest of Semen Skalich, a leader of the penitents from Drahovich in 1980. He was charged under paragraph 2, spreading slanderous fabrications directed against the Soviet political and social system with the purpose of inciting especially grave crimes against the Soviet state. The fabrications reportedly consisted of anti-Soviet poetry. He was reportedly sentenced to 10 years special regime labor camp and 5 years exile. And this is information from Keston College. Now, another article, 187.1 of the Criminal Code of Ukraine corresponded to Article 191 of the Russian Criminal Code, and it was introduced in 1966. So this is already under the revised criminal codes. And this was circulation of deliberately false concoctions or fabrications slandering the Soviet state and social order. It was punishable by up to 3 years deprivation of liberty, or up to 1 year of correctional labor, or by a fine of up to 100 rubles. Bishop Vasyl Velichkovsky was tried on September 23, 1969, under this Article 187.1, for knowingly and systematically spreading false information about the Soviet government in oral and written form. He was sentenced under Articles 138 and 187-1 to 3 years confinement in a strict regime labor camp, which he served in a psychiatric prison hospital in Kommunarsk in the Luhansk region. In poor health, he was released on January 27, 1972, and expelled from the USSR, visiting Rome and then emigrating to Canada, where he died the following year. Vasyl Kobrin, chairman of the Action Group for the Defense of Believers in the Church in Ukraine, was arrested in Lviv on November 11, 1984. He was tried under Article 187.1 on March 22, 1985, and sentenced to 3 years ordinary regime camp. Article 214, malicious evasion of fulfillment of a decision concerning arrangement of work and discontinuance of a parasitic existence. The punishment was deprivation of liberty or correctional labor for up to 2 years. Father Mikhail Minitsky was arrested for the 4th time in June 1985 near Lviv on charges of parasitism. Another article used sometimes against religious prisoners was Article 296 of the Ukrainian Criminal Code on hooliganism. Ukrainian Greek Catholics were also harassed by being charged with various administrative offenses, not criminal, in other words. For example, Father Stefan Hrihorovich of Mukachi and his daughter Katrusha were arrested on March 18, 1984, for not carrying Soviet identity papers. Although further judicial procedures were not known, Katrusha, a medical student, was reportedly expelled from her course. This was a common form of persecution of believers, as was dismissal from teaching positions. Priests and seminarians were sometimes drafted into the armed forces. In April 1945, the NKGB raided and closed the Lviv Theological Academy and the seminary and precentor's school, and it detained 159 students. It delivered them to the draft office, and 120 of them were inducted into the Soviet Army. Punitive psychiatry was another form of administrative punishment used against religious believers. The above discussion of the various statutes used to persecute the UGCC and its faithful leaves unanswered an obvious question. Why was there no law simply banning the church? One motive may have been the damage that the existence of such a law would have done to the USSR's international image. In the eyes of the world community, banning an entire church is simply not done. By declining to pass such a law, the Soviet government could maintain the fiction that the UGCC had voluntarily dissolved itself. Any claim by an individual or group in the name of that church could then be dismissed as false, and even depicted as an attempt to disguise unlawful political or criminal activity. In the absence of a law specifically banning the UGCC, Soviet prosecutors had to exercise some creativity in finding laws by which to harass and intimidate members of the church, persuade them to join the ROC, or at least dissuade them from overt religious activity. Why did the prosecutors choose the laws they did? In the immediate post-war years, an accusation of treason, which carried the highest penalties, could be leveled at virtually anyone who had survived the German occupation. The vague and overbroad label of anti-Soviet agitation or propaganda could be applied to a wide range of religious activity. Of course, the statutes relating specifically to religious activity were also available. Since 2014, the UGCC has again been suffering persecution, this time in Russian-occupied territories in eastern and southern Ukraine. Methods similar to those of the Soviet regime, including the abuse of law, are being applied, even though the laws are somewhat different. No doubt, the example of the Catacomb Church will help contemporary Ukrainian Greek Catholics endure. Thank you for your attention.
Дякую дуже. Thank you very much, Dr. Surakovsky. Питання чи дискусія? Що далі? Прикінці? Our next speaker is Dr. Irina Ivankovich. Dr. Ivankovich started her work at St. Sophia Religious Association Ukrainian Catholics USA in 2008 and became a member of the association's board of directors in 2017. She was elected president in 2018 and re-elected in 2023. She is a member of the board of St. Sophia Association in Rome, as well as a director of the Yosef Slipi Research Center. Dr. Ivankovich is a linguist, translator, and literary critic. Born in Vidvolochinsk, Ternopil region, she graduated from Warsaw University, Institute of Applied Linguistics, with a master's in arts in translation and English philology. In 2012, she defended her doctoral dissertation with the highest honors, summa cum laude, in the field of sociolinguistics at the Ukrainian Free University in Munich. She has served as professor of English as a secondary language in universities and colleges in Poland and in the United States. She has translated many vital books into Ukrainian, among them Yaroslav Pelikan's Confessor Between East and West, a portrait of Ukrainian Cardinal Yosef Slipi, Morris West's novel Shoes of the Fisherman, Our Lady of Guadalupe, Mother of the Civilization of Love, To the Light of the Resurrection Through the Thorns of the Catacombs, and Blessed Vasil Velichkovsky's History of the Miraculous Icon of the Mother of God of Perpetual Help. She has compiled numerous books and anthologies of literary works about Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky and Yosef Slipi, and edited the multilingual edition of the Testament of Patriarch Yosef Slipi, and From Sambor to Saskatoon, Memories of Father Volodymyr Ivashko for the Youth. She is the author of the 2-volume book Patriarch Yosef Slipi and Literature, which was awarded the Best Book of 2016 Publishers Forum in Lviv. Dr. Ivankovich is the founder of the ESL, Ukraine Charity Platform, which houses such projects as the ESL Charity Summer School in Zazlist, Ukraine, the birthplace of Yosef Slipi, for orphans, displaced persons, children of the Ukrainian military men, and the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church seminarians, as well as the School for the ESL Christian Camp Counselors, and ESL for ONL, English for Odessa Naval Lyceum. She is the author of more than 30 scholarly articles in Ukrainian, Polish, and English in linguistics, literary studies, and history. She is a corresponding member of the Shevchenko Scientific Society, USA, the recipient of a Volunteer with Ukraine in the Heart Medal, as well as the Ukrainian World Coordination Council Medal. Today she will regale us with the chronology and geography of Patriarch Yosif's imprisonment. Please welcome Dr. Irena Ivankovich. Yep. Дуже добре.
Слава Ісусу Христу! Your Excellency, Very Reverend Father, Venerable Sisters, Friends of St. Sophia Religious Association. On April 11, 1945, the Soviet regime officially launched a repressive campaign against the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, arresting its leader, Metropolitan of Lviv and Halych, Yosif Slipy, along with all the church hierarchs. However, we know little about those years of forced labor, suffering, torture, and persecution. Only recently have publications begun to appear that shed light on archival materials from this period of Slipy's life, such as the 2-volume edition edited by Professor Volodymyr Sergeychuk, Patriarch Yosif Slipy and the Documents of the Soviet State Security Organs, 1939-1987, published in 2012 in Kyiv. Nonetheless, the most valuable accounts are always the memoirs of the participants of those events. Memoirs written by Patriarch Yosif Slipy during a retreat in 1963-1964 at the Passionist Fathers Monastery in Nettuno, Italy, were published in the fall of 2014 in Lviv. By tracking press reports from 1968-1970 about the pastoral journeys of Metropolitan Slipy to Ukrainian communities in exile, compiled by Olga Vitoshenska in the book The Journeys of His Beatitude Yosef VII, 1968-1970, and selecting certain fragments from the copy of his memoirs, a chronology of the imprisonment of this great confessor of faith has been compiled. The Patriarch was reluctant to publicly speak about this thorny path. However, even sparse testimonies impress the reader with the depth of suffering. Quoting, "I was sentenced to death by the Bolsheviks 37 times, and the anxious waiting for execution was sometimes so great that when I placed my hand on my head, I would pull out clumps of hair." End of quote from the Catholic Standard and Times, Philadelphia, July 26, 1968. On April 11, 1945, Slipy was arrested by the NKVD. Quoting, "I was arrested on April 11, 1945 at around 7 p.m. It was a Wednesday. Since morning, St. George's Cathedral had been surrounded by guards. They were watching for any movements and ensuring nothing was being removed. Many cars filled with police arrived. Colonel Melnikov brought me a warrant from the prosecutor for my arrest. I was searched, taken to a car, and transported to Lonsky prison. I remember how unpleasant it was to feel the rough hands of a thug on me." End of quote from Memoirs. From April 11, 1945 till May 10, 1946, Yosif Slipy was investigated at the prison on Lonsky Street in Lviv, Kyiv-Lukyanivska prison, and Moscow Lubyanka. Quoting, "Kyiv looked quite destroyed, and it was early morning of April the 12th, 1945. From the station, I was taken to the most severe interrogation prison in Kyiv at 33 Korolenko Street. After a long and torturous search, I was first placed in solitary confinement and later in a cell. My investigation was conducted by Huryun, who later became the head of the KGB in Lviv, a terribly rude and crude person. During Huryun's interrogations, they would take me for 2 to 3 hours to 2 other investigators in a large, dark room. One sat in a corner by a dim lamp, and the elder one began to persuade me to apostatize. Then they came closer to me from the desk, and by the lit lamp, they persistently continued to torture me and urged me to renounce the Catholic Church. I said nothing, only thinking I should thank God for not losing my mind. Then the younger investigator began to voice my thoughts out loud. I assumed he was some hypnotist or clairvoyant. I had encountered such people in France before. I was sent back to the cell. Starvation, sleeplessness, and interrogations can drive one insane. And then I understood that no one should be blamed for signing false confessions, slander, or agreeing to spying. It was the great grace of God that I endured all these torments. End of quote from his memoirs. The sentence of the military tribunal behind closed doors was 8 years of Siblag. Siblag stands for Siberian Corrective Labor Camp, a part of the infamous Gulag system in the Soviet Union. It was established in the early 1930s as part of the USSR's forced labor camp network, overseen by the NKVD and that later became the KGB. Siblag was located in the Novosibirsk and Kemerovo regions of Siberia, known for its harsh climate. Prisoners sent to Siblag included political dissidents, intellectuals, and ordinary people caught up in Stalin's purges, as well as those convicted of petty crimes. They were forced to work in extremely difficult conditions, often in agriculture, logging, mining, and construction. The camp was notorious for its brutal treatment of inmates, lack of adequate food, poor medical care, and high mortality rates. It remained active for many years, particularly during the height of Stalin's repressive policies. Transfers. The first stop was Novosibirsk. Quoting, "The convicts are sent into exile that lasts for months. They arrive at the transfer emaciated, exhausted, and chained to rough boards cold as ice. Besides the exile itself, the physical torment breaks a person," recalled Joseph Slipe in a homily about the exile of St. Clement the Pope. Mariinsk, Kemerovo region. Joseph Slipe suffered from pneumonia and dysentery. Quoting, "In Mariinsk, I was assigned to the most bandit-filled barrack, but a Belarusian teacher paramedic and a Lithuanian paramedic protected me from the bandits as best as they could and provided me with the most necessary medicines." End of quote from the memoir. In February 1947, Joseph Slipe was transferred to Bohemia. He broke his arm here. Quoting, "They break ribs for others, but they only broke your arm," the doctor said. "I was taken to the hospital. They bandaged my arm, which somehow healed." End of quote from the memoirs. City of Kirov in Russia. Quoting, "After a few days, we were again sent on a transfer. In the pouring rain, we walked uphill to the railway station 3 to 5 kilometers, and then further in special wagons to Pechora. On the way, they only gave me hot water. The transfers are the most torturous, simply murderous. With similar adventures, we finally were brought to Pechora. Excuse me. Sorry. On the way, they only gave me hot water. I guess I need to regain my voice.
We can get some hot water.
I do have some in my wallet. I didn't anticipate that. I'm really sorry. Where was I? Okay. So we saw camps all along the way from Yatka to Inta on both sides of the tracks. End of quote from memoirs. The group on the transfer included up to 40 people, 3 priests and 2 bishops, Josef Slipy and Nicholas Chernetsky. In 1947, he was transferred to a camp in Pechora in Ta. Quoting, "Pechora is the worst camp after Kolyma and Norilsk. The Arctic eternal frost, daylight half a year and night for the other half. Next stop, camp in Kosyukomi as ASSR Pechma. He was transferred so often they wouldn't keep him longer for 9 months in one camp in fear of having influence on people. That's how majestic and powerful he was." Quoting, "It took almost a month to reach this camp. His beatitude was in terrible condition, sick and feverish," recalled his inmate Ferdinand Sapihal. From August 1948 till 1949, he was kept in camp number 23 in Temnikovsky district, Mordovia. Quoting, "I lay there in the hospital, sick with lung disease, with 38 degrees fever, although several times I was thrown out by order of the operator. I was put in with tuberculosis patients, and I stayed there all winter in 1948-49. But for some reason, I was transferred to another camp due to suspicion that supervision was helping me send letters." End of quote from memoirs. In 1950, Slipy was sent on a transfer to testify in court in Kyiv, then returned to Pechma, and then to camp number 14. On May 15, 1953, he was summoned to the commissariat, where again they offered him to join Orthodoxy, promising the restoration of his titles and the possible granting of the highest spiritual position in the Russian Orthodox Church. Metropolitan Yosef firmly refused, which resulted in sending him to a house for the disabled. In June 1953, he was summoned to Moscow to establish contacts with the Vatican. He was asked to write the history of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church and the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. At that time, Lavrentiy Beria was removed from power. In 1954-56, after Lavrentiy Beria's execution, Slipy was once again sent to live in the village of Maklakovo near Yeniseisk in Siberia, in a home for the disabled. Quoting, "It was the worst place, the farthest remote from any scholarly and cultural centers. I had to live there, cast away and cut off from any access to my homeland, 6,000 kilometers away." End of quote from the memoirs. He wrote the history of the Universal Church from memory and pastoral letters, which he passed on to trusted individuals to send to Ukraine. the KGB intercepted the manuscript of the history. In 1957, on the occasion of the 40th anniversary of Slipy's priesthood, Pope Pius XII sent greetings to the Metropolitan in exile. The letter obviously did not arrive, but it, along with confiscating the manuscript of the history of the Universal Church, led to a new arrest. Yosef Slipy was taken to Yeniseisk, Krasnoyarsk, and Kyiv. June 1959, Slipy sentenced to 7 years of imprisonment. He was sent to Kamchatka and then to the Taishet camps. Quoting, "When U.S. Vice President Richard Nixon and his delegation were traveling through Siberia, I was held in Novosibirsk for about a month because they were not sending any transport wagons to the camps so that the Americans would not see them and get a bad impression. During those transfers, I often starved and was on the verge of death." End of quote from the memoirs. 1960, Yosef Slipy is transferred to Pochma. Quoting, "The transfers are cattle wagons packed with prisoners, guarded by towers, machine guns, and illuminated by searchlights. Through a small grated window, 10 by 10 centimeters in size, one could see the endless expanses of Siberia," recalled Avram Shifrin from Munich. Next transit points were Sverdlovsk, Chulna, and Novochunki. In December 1960, Yosef Slipy was sent to Kyiv and asked about his maximum and minimum demands to the government. They tried to persuade him to make a statement against the Pope and nationalists abroad. Quoting, "You mock me and my church, destroy and ruin everything that exists, and still want me to speak out against those who stand with me and resist," was Metropolitan Slipy's response. In October 1961, the Supreme Court declared Yosef Slipy a particularly dangerous recidivist criminal and sent him to the camp in Mordovia, the village of Yavas. He arrived there suffering from pneumonia. Quoting, "In 1962, I was in one of the Mordovian camps, already so weakened that I thought I would die soon. One day, I was lying on a table that also served as a bed. A guard approached me and almost politely asked, 'Old man, how do you feel?' The tone of his voice and the very question were so unbelievable and unusual for the entire 18 years I spent in the camps that it left a deep impression on me. Still, I managed to give a detached response, as well as one can in prison. 'Well, old man,' he replied, 'soon it will be over.' Some guards shouted, 'The Roman one is releasing him.' I was even allowed to go to the library." End of quote from the memoirs. On January the 26th, 1963, Yosef Slipy was officially released with the efforts of Pope John XXIII and US President John Kennedy. Quoting, "Then they sent me to Moscow, where I stayed briefly in the Patriarch's residence. From there, I was moved to a hotel where Monsignor Johannes Willebrands, the special envoy of Pope John XXIII, was waiting for me. He told me he had come to take me to Rome. Initially, I responded that I would prefer to stay with my faithful in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. But when he explained that it was the Holy Father's wish for me to attend the Vatican Council, I had to agree." End of quote from the Esquint newspaper, Buenos Aires, September 29, 1968. In Moscow, Joseph Slipy requested permission to say goodbye to his family before being sent to Rome. Under the guise of family, Father Vasil Velichkovsky, the superior of the Redemptorist monastery in Ternopil, came. Metropolitan Slipy consecrated him as the Bishop of Lutsk in the hotel room and appointed him his deputy. Quoting, "I wrote for Father Vasil Velichkovsky. He came, took my belongings, and on February 4th, 1963, I consecrated him as a bishop. In the meantime, Monsignor Willebrands arrived and some official brought him to the hotel to meet me. I expressed my doubts to him about the situation of our church. We debated all day. He thought about it all night and finally convinced me to go to Rome because it was the Pope's wish. He also handed me an autograph from Pope John the 23rd. The next day, proto-priest Vitaly Borovoy, who accompanied us to the train station, arrived. The head of the protocol brought my passport and visas, and beforehand, proto-priest Borovoy warned us about possible eavesdropping. While crossing the border into Poland, the KGB thoroughly checked us, even though Monsignor Willebrands had assured me that there would be no inspection." End of quote from the memoirs. On February the 9th, 1963, Joseph Slipy arrived at the monastery in Grottaferrata, Italy. He met with Pope John the 23rd and presented him with a map of the USSR marking the concentration camps where he had been held. This attempt to provide at least a general background of Joseph Slipy's hardship during the years 1955-1963 is only a modest contribution to depicting the tragedy of the head of the clandestine church, who, thanks to his unwavering faith and indomitable spirit, inscribed his name in golden letters in the history of the martyrology of the Church of Christ. These and other facts about Joseph Slipy's life and martyrdom can be found in the newly published monograph, Patriarch Joseph Slipy, Facets and Beacons, which I am privileged to present today. The book honors the 80th anniversary of the beginning of a massive attack on Ukrainian identity in the spiritual, intellectual, and cultural spheres by the totalitarian Soviet regime. The book was published by the Artus Publishing House in Lviv. This collection consists of Ukrainian, English, and Polish articles that aim to convey the multifaceted roles of Cardinal Slipy to both Ukrainian and foreign language readers. The research conducted between 2014 and 2024 using archival materials from the Joseph Slipy Research Center here at St. Sophia sheds light on little-known aspects of the life and principles of the Cardinal of the clandestine church. The book also includes the Stations of the Cross based on Joseph Slipy's life, rare photographs, the geography of his imprisonment, and details of his 3 visits to the United States in 1968, 1973, and 1976. The monograph also presents linguistic, literary, sociological, and memoiristic studies on the Patriarch, his interactions with various scientific institutions, and prominent scholars. Some of the key elements guiding Joseph Slipy in his pastoral activities presented in the collection are the reconstruction of Ukrainian identity in the diaspora, the struggle for the patriarchal structure of the UGCC, the consolidation of the faithful around the idea of the patriarchate, active reminders to the Vatican about the mountains of corpses and rivers of blood of Ukrainians for their loyalty to the Apostolic See, the defense of the rights of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, particularly in Poland, the establishment of academic centers and cultivation of scholarly efforts around the Ukrainian Catholic and Ukrainian Free universities. The foreword to the book was written by His Excellency Igor Wozniak, Metropolitan of Lviv. In the preface to the edition, Patriarch Sviatoslav Shevchuk noted, quoting, "The collection Patriarch Yosef Slipy, Facets and Beacons offers a fresh perspective on this giant of the spirit. Here we find an analysis of linguistic, literary, historical, epistolary, and factual discourse. The articles in English and Polish, alongside the Ukrainian ones, promote the activities of Yosef Slipy among non-Ukrainian speaking readers, which in the time of hybrid war is a powerful tool for spreading reliable information about Ukraine around the world." In the afterword to the collection, His Eminence Mykola Cardinal Butchok, Eparch of Australia, emphasized, quoting, "The multifaceted nature of Yosef Slipy's personality is striking, captivating, and inspiring. Therefore, we welcome with gratitude these studies that present to us and non-Ukrainian readers the image of a pastor, scholar, intellectual, educator, ethnarch, leader, Christian, and uncompromising fighter for the rights of the church and the people." End of quote. The American scholar Yaroslav Pelikan, the author of The Confessor Between East and West, a portrait of the Ukrainian Cardinal Yosef Slipy, once drew attention to an interesting fact, quoting, "Despite the considerable amount of literature on Cardinal Slipy, including the martyrological biography by Milena Rudnitska, The Invisible Stigmata, it is impossible to speak about the true biography of Yosef Slipy in the conventional historiographical sense of the word. What is possible is only a historical portrait, or rather a series of portraits of several of his main vocations throughout his life, as they manifested themselves and later found reflection in his active work in the final years." End of quote. The collection Patriarch Yosef Slipy, Facets and Beacons adds depth to each of these portraits, which have retained their relevance and acquired particular sharpness in light of Russia's genocidal war against Ukraine. The study of Yosef Slipy's legacy and personality continues, led by those whose life creed resonates with the motto of Confessor of Faith, per aspera ad astra, through hardship to the stars. And to conclude this presentation, I would like to share a brief video recorded by Bishop Hriblonchena 7 years ago, maybe 8, I forgot, while he still was an eparch of England, where he shares his thoughts about Yosef Slipy. It's a wonderful video, so let's just have some time watching it.
Patriarch and Cardinal Joseph Slipy was a very majestic person. When you met him, then you were in awe of his persona. He has gone through many years of great suffering. He was arrested by the Soviets in 1945. He spent 18 years in Soviet prisons. So this was a man marked by suffering and tortures. But yet he was not a bitter man. Yes, it's true, he was quite severe with himself and with other people. He did not mince words. He said it as it was. But this was a man who had great vision and a great love for God, for his church, and for his Ukrainian people.
Well, he did not spend more than half a year in one Gulag camp because the Soviets were very afraid of any kind of contacts that he had with prisoners, because he was such a majestic personality that everybody, you can tell this was an extraordinary person.
We need role models, and Patriarch Joseph is a great role model for all ages, because first of all, this was a person who had principles, lived according to principles. He did not allow any kinds of promises, false promises, and promises for an easier life. He did not allow these things to turn him away from his church and from his assignment, his mission, because very often we find people going and compromising themselves for an easier life, for money, for power. This was a man who did not look at these things. He always said that evil cannot last in eternity. He always believed the Ukraine would be independent, and as a proof of this, when he was publishing books of the Ukrainian Catholic University, he would always set aside 50 copies in a separate room, which was always locked, and this, he said, was to be transported to Ukraine when it becomes free and independent. Now, when we were listening to this, we were smirking and saying, well, yes, perhaps in our lifetime, maybe at the end of our lives, maybe this will be possible. But you see, not even 10 years after his death, these books were transported to Ukraine. He visited England in the 1930s, and he even wrote about it. So this country was already known to him before. He came in 1970 as the major Archbishop of Lviv, of the Ukrainian Catholic Church, and he visited most of the parishes. He visited London. There were days and concerts and events in honor of him. He celebrated the Divine Liturgy in almost all of our parishes here. He was led by the bishop, the local bishop here, Bishop Augustine, plus other bishops of Europe would come to accompany him. So he did visit because he wanted to come to know the Ukrainian diaspora of Great Britain, and also to encourage them in their life of faith and in their cultural life. Patriarch Joseph Slipi founded the Religious Society of Saint Sophia. At first, one was in Rome, then others in the United States. He also founded a branch here in Great Britain. And in Holland Park, he initiated the purchase of a building at 79 Holland Park, in which he wanted to house a branch of the Ukrainian Catholic University. So this was his initiative. He also gave a large sum of money as a loan, but after having bought the premises, and when the sum was being repaid, he said, no, keep it here and have this as an endowment fund for the Ukrainian Patriarchal Society. The role of the Ukrainian Catholic University is to educate young people in the different subjects of different fields, and the branches that are all over the world, here in London, there's one in Rome, in other countries, they have as their aim to foster this education, and to, although we don't have, for example, classes, we don't have regular classes here except for the Ukrainian language, but we have different speeches, conferences, seminars which are taking place on different subjects of Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian religious life. He always called Ukrainians to unite, to be aware that they are one country, that they belong to one nation. And whether you are the Ukrainians in Ukraine or in Europe or in the Americas or Australia, we all belong to the same roots. And so even if people were living in the diaspora, and of course they were taking on the culture of the other nations, he always taught that we should take everything that is good from these nations and apply it also to your own people in order to enrich each other.
Well, thank you very much for your attention. I pass the floor to our chair.
Дякую дуже, пані. можливість на питання.
Я думаю,
Yeah.
старок скаже.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think we have two very compelling and informative presentations. Are there any questions? Oh dear. I'm turning this around. No one wants to see me. Hi, Mom. Можна? There we go. Чи є якісь питання? Are there any questions? Yes, Panie.
Well, I was just going to make a comment. I don't know if the first speaker is still online, they can hear us or not.
Panie Professor, are you still with us?
He is.
He is, okay.
He
But
is.
can
He's
you hear me
muted.
from me or I have to talk into a microphone?
No, you should be.
He should hear. Okay, I just wanted to make a comment that I remember two things about, I remember seeing a video from a priest who was released from Siberia. And he was arrested in 1945, during that time. And he was arrested by a corporal in the army. And all the information about him was on an index card. And they said his name, and they were questioning him as to whether he was going to be willing to sign that affidavit. And he said he wasn't going to do it. And then he noticed that that wasn't the correct name. He said, "That's not my name. You don't have the right index card." And the corporal said, "Well, that's okay. It doesn't matter. You're all going to Siberia anyhow." So he wrote down whatever it was. The other interesting thing was that when my father, in 1939, when the Soviets first occupied Western Ukraine, he was in Krychivchi with his father, was Father Ivan Isayu was there. And at that point, my mother and the older kids, I wasn't born yet, already went to the other side, to the German side of the occupation, to Krynecha. But my father was still there. He had to escape later on. So as the Soviet government was establishing itself, they had elections. 99% of the people voted for everybody on the board. And they had this great meeting where they approved all these laws. There were 100 laws. Now, my father, the everlasting academic intellectual, said, "My goodness," he got up and said, "These laws, these people here can't even understand what they mean. How do you expect them to to understand these laws?" And he said, "Oh, that's the whole point," said the commissar. "When we decide who we want to arrest, then we can find the law that he broke." So, thank you.
Дякую дуже, пане доктор. Indeed, the totalitarianism of bureaucracy. Так, прошу пані.
We heard about the arrest of priests and the seminarians were thrown into the Soviet army. Is there information about sisters and monasteries and what they went through?
Pане Professor, would you like to answer that one?
Well, yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes, there is information, and I have not looked into it, more than others. I mean, I've seen quite a bit of mention about that. I think the sisters were very wise in concealing their activity. They could live in communal groups in apartments and appear to be simply ordinary Soviet citizens living together as a family or as related people. And so it was they were able to escape notice because they did not necessarily wear habits, they did not necessarily do anything in the open which would attract attention, but they were still sisters. Many of them served also in hospitals as nurses. They had secular jobs, and yet they maintained their vows and their regimen of prayer. So they could escape notice. They also were responsible for maintaining a network, not only in Ukraine but outside of Ukraine, and thus a lot of information was relayed by the sisters through visiting sisters. So they were an important link in the underground church. And this has been documented. How thoroughly I cannot judge, but it is known that they were a very important element of the underground church. Many were, of course, arrested and did end up in the camps, and we see that in some of the memoirs, I think, of Joseph Slippy and of others. But there were many who, by very wisely conducting themselves, escaped notice.
Thank you, Dr. Sotokovsky. Are there, yes?
One more question observation. A few years ago, I ran into two young people just talking about random things. And somehow or other, talk of the Soviet Union came up. And I think they were old enough, they had finished college, but they looked totally perplexed. They had no idea what it was. Meanwhile, I once had a conversation with two people who are in their 70s, and they were just so astounded they discovered the word concept Holodomor, and they said, how did we get to be 70 and we never heard of this? So as far as our country here is concerned, that's not important in the world of learning of academia to teach Soviet Union bad.
Well, I think the world has changed tremendously over the course of the last decade, since 2014 in particular. One of the side effects of the invasion of Ukraine, because we all grew up in the United States, we all grew up with our elevator pitch. We had to explain to everybody what Ukrainians were. No, we're not Russians, for goodness sakes. There's a difference between Soviets and Russia. There's the Soviet Union and Russia. Those questions are no longer being asked. Those questions don't need to be asked. The world is, Putin has had many impacts, and one of them is the fact that he absolutely put Ukraine on the map when it comes to just general world consciousness in a way that the Klitschkos never could by themselves. And so in that sense we made strides, which strikes me because I have the pleasure also serving in the Ukrainian Heritage School. When the Ukrainian children come over from this country and their ignorance of the Soviet period. Because here you kind of expected, Americans were idiots. And the world accepts us, we're charming in that fashion. But those that lived in the countries of the former Soviet, being also oblivious to that history, that to me was very shocking. I do have a question, however, about Pope Pius XII sent the birthday card to Blazhenishi while he was in the Gulag.
Yeah, he wrote the letter, congratulatory letter.
Did he think he was going to get there? That struck me as strange. That his Holy Father would, because, it stands to reason there would be potentially negative consequences in a religious phobic totalitarian state, and yet he did that.
He wrote a congratulatory letter. That's what it says in the memoirs.
Chicago. Are there any other questions? Yes.
Are there any studies done about priests that did sign over to the ROC? How long they actually last there, and that their intention was to keep the Ukrainian Catholic Church alive under the guise of the Roman Russian Orthodox Church. Are there any studies?
Dr. Sotokovsky?
I'm not aware of any studies, but there may be something that I'm not aware of because a lot has been published in Ukraine and I don't have access to those studies, but I'm not aware of any. Of course, that fact is well known, and it was indeed an issue in 1990, 1991, whether to accept those priests back into the Greek Catholic Church or not. That was a big issue. So there must have been something, non-academic at least, written about that. The memoirs, of course, the Institute of Church History at the Ukrainian Catholic University does have a vast archive of memoirs of priests, tape recordings they made, and they no doubt made mention of those of their colleagues who had joined the Russian Orthodox Church pro forma and remained, in their hearts Greek Catholics. Whether there's been any academic study, I do not know. By the way, I should also mention that Father Lanchena is, of course, the author of one of the really first compilations of information about the martyrology of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church that was published by Smoloskip in the 1980s, and I used that, and that's still a very important source. But I'm not current with the current, more recent studies now.
Yeah, Professor, Your Eminence?
Thank you. My question is directed at Dr. Elena. If you have shared what you've shared with us today about your most recent book in English and Polish and Ukrainian, wonderful forewords, of course, and compliments from those who wrote forwards. Do you have plans to publicize this in some way, shape or form in other countries? You're connected with St. Sophia Society, and are you using that as a platform, hopefully, to spread some of this information, this research that you've done? I think of some of the generational issues that we've heard where young people don't even know about these things, you know, and that would be probably one of the age-old problems that even we would face. How do we help make known the information that we have? Because, I mean, my gosh, the scriptures are centuries years old, and there are people who haven't read the Book of John, you know. So, do you have some plans to make that public?
Well, thank you, Your Eminence, Your Excellency. Obviously, my dream would be to have book presentation in as many countries as possible, because I know that even for us Ukrainians,
like in Toronto, wink, wink, not much, right?
thank you very much. Witnesses. Even for Ukrainians, I had a privilege of speaking about Joseph Slipy at the conference last month. And one of the roundtables was specifically on Ukraine, on the topic of Ukraine, and even Ukrainian scholars have never heard, or maybe, oh, I heard the name, but I don't know who he was, or who this person is. So obviously the education is necessary and needed. Here at St. Sophia, we do that work with our youth. I think the wonderful platform of delivering the message about Joseph Slipy legacy would be World Youth Day in Rome, when you are going to have youth from Ukrainian youth from different countries. So that would be a place where we could send the message, we could speak about his legacy. Obviously, as Professor Rudnitsky said, social media is a huge platform where our youth is currently getting information from. So yeah, that sort of information, maybe in a more concise form, would be a wonderful source of information via social media.
Mm-hmm.
You can help.
I'm thinking of September in Toronto, in particularly in our school boards, is designated as a Heritage Month for Ukraine. And under my guidance, we have an elementary school named Joseph Cardinal Slipy. And so maybe something,
stands open?
yes, anything that would certainly be directed to staff and parents would be welcome. But I'm thinking with some thought, how would we make that pertinent to elementary school students? You know, because they're going to a school that's named, Joseph Cardinal Slipy. Who was the man? Do they know? Probably not.
Well,
and so I invite some forethought put into that direction where hopefully, we could do something.
well,
Before the tariffs kick in. It's a wonderful idea, and not just in Toronto, but Germany, Poland. I mean, there's a reason why you use so many languages, and we should go to, what did he used to say, for the Dichter verstehen and the Landesdichter gehen. So we got to take it out to them. At the same time, social media, absolutely.
Sure.
And cutifying it. I don't know the proper expression. You had a video playing earlier today that was animated, but it was simple, light. It was welcoming.
Dr. Isai was going to use it, yeah, for his presentation.
Yes, Dr. Isayu.
Yeah, I just wanted to address the question about the priests who did sign and continued to be basically Catholic priests. Now, as I said on my father's side, Father Ivan Isayu, who was in Krihuchi, and when the Soviets arrived in 1945. Now, this is according to family tradition. I don't know if this has been completely verified or not, but our cousins, the distant cousins that we met for the first time in the year 2000, told me that the story was this, that the invading forces were purely the army, the military. There were no KGB agents. And one night, the colonel in charge knocked on the door of my grandfather and he said, "I have orders to arrest you tomorrow." Now, I'm a military man and I'm religious, and I do not arrest priests of any church. So I want you to leave town and we'll say that you escaped. And he said, "No, I'm not going to leave. Do what you have to do because I'm not going to leave my people." So he was so perplexed, he came back the next day and he said, "You know, there's only one church here. There was no Orthodox church, only the Catholic church in that town." He said, "Well, your wife's name is Filippiu, maiden name. Well, I'm writing her name down as Filippo. And your name, Isayu, you are Isayev. And you are our Orthodox priest." And he did not arrest him. And he was, and he was never arrested. He died in was it in early 50s, and he served in that so-called Orthodox church. Now, I don't know how true it is, but I do know that when we went there and visited his grave, the monument said Ivan Isayev, and it said Filipa, his wife Filipa. So we had to spend $2,000 to make a new monument to correct the spelling. So that's one episode.
I just brainstorming it. Reflecting what Ludwika was saying, and you're publicizing Patriarch Stipe and all that. Couldn't the powers that be who run the church pick one day out of every year that's some kind of significant day in his life and have, like every church everywhere, have a slushba vaja, and then before that, the priest could announce that and like teach people a little bit about him? Or is that the...
No, I don't think that the Archbishop would have, I mean, we'd have to talk.
Well, every 5 or 10 years, when it's the anniversary, the round anniversary, they do designate the day, and even a year of Patriarch Yosef. This year is of Metropolitan Sheptetsky. It's his 160th anniversary. So they do that. And then within that year, there are a series of various symposiums, conferences, and scholarly events to promote him as he should be promoted. But even from my personal experience with working in Zazdrist, we have a wonderful museum. For years, it wasn't known, it wasn't promoted, as you said, on the church level. And it honestly takes the labor of lay people to push it to the masses and to attract sightseeing tourists to come, so that my mother can teach them about the legacy of Yosef Slipe, about his life. And people do come from different parts of Ukraine, and they are oblivious of this museum, they are oblivious of the person that Slipe was. So even though, going back to your question, even though there are years that are designated for specific church leaders, still it is not enough. On maybe lower level, as you said, in smaller communities where it can be addressed to an imminent circle of people involved in their service. And it can start even on the eparchial level or even parochial level. I don't think we need a blessing or from the top. It can be done, initiated locally. But you're absolutely right. Yes, it is needed, very much needed.
One more thought before we break for lunch. I don't recall if I ever saw it written down, but I absolutely remember that it was said, and I overheard by eavesdropping, in some capacity. Blazhenishi Slipi established St. Sophia Religious Association of Ukrainian Catholics, heavily with laity in it, for a reason. What he witnessed through the liquidation of the Ukraine, there was a certain degree of disenchantment with some of his colleagues, and it stuck with him. I think it was most telling that he could not be kept in the same prison for more than 6 months because of his charisma. He had a magnificent, magnetic personality. When he became so disenchanted with his colleagues, he didn't give up, he didn't capitulate, he pivoted. Having many eyes on the inside as well as the outside was in the best service of carrying out God's mission. Again, I've never seen that written down, that he intentionally chose laity to be the dominant presence in St. Sophia Religious Association of Ukrainian Catholics.
But it's in the name, and we always abide by that name, that it's a religious, not clergy or church society, which is...
Religious, not church, yes. Are there any other questions? So, дуже вам дякую. Thank you very much for a lovely early morning session, or morning session, not early one. We welcome you now to the dining hall for kava and
Lunch.
Lunch. That's what I
Full-fledged lunch.
Дякую.